And, let's be honest, if it's a fashion competition, the royalists definitely win.
You better work.
Hi everybody, it's Margot here with another episode of Crown and Kingdom. King Charles Stuart I was born on the 19th of November, 1600, but it would be his death nearly 49 years later that would forever leave its mark in the minds of the public and in the annals of history. The king's demise came at the end of a drawn-out war for power that would rip the country apart, leave over 200,000 people dead, and lose the king, his crown, his country, and his head. So come with me as I tell you the story of the downfall and execution of King Charles Stuart I, and what was found in his tomb 150 years after he died. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help me keep my channel growing.
Charles Stuart was born in Dunfermline Palace in Scotland on the 19th of November 1600, the son of King James VI and his wife Anne of Denmark. Shortly after King James inherited the English throne from his cousin, the childless Queen Elizabeth I, in 1603, Charles was created the Duke of York, the customary title for the English king's second son, because Charles was never supposed to wear the crown. His older brother, Prince Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, had been born in Stirling Castle in February of 1594, and it was a widely established fact that it would be he who succeeded to the throne upon the death of his father. And, truthfully, Prince Henry was an excellent candidate for the role. He was incredibly popular with the public, devoutly religious, and highly interested in the running of the nation. By his teen years, he was already an active leader as the Duke of Cornwall and a Prince of Wales, even appointing deputy governors in the North American colonies. He was well educated, versed in both music and dance, was an able horse rider, a keen fencer, and an adept player of both tennis and golf. He vocally intended to use his father's struggles as a guide of what not to do as king, and had modern ideas about working with Parliament in order to avoid repeating James's mistakes. He was determined to become fluent in both Latin and Italian, dressed in fine clothes, including perfumed gloves, and who doesn't love a perfumed glove? And he insisted that both he and his entire household regularly attend church services. While out with his father, crowds would form around the young prince, as everybody, courtiers and public alike, sought out the promising young heir's attention. Charles, on the other hand, was sickly, unable to walk without assistance until the age of 3.5, wore specialty shoes to help his weak ankles, was painfully shy, was slow to learn speech, and would develop a stammer that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Although he did his best to emulate his older brother, Charles's popularity and aptitude seemed to pale in comparison, as did his personage. Even as an adult, he never reached beyond 5 feet, 4 inches tall. One anecdote states that although Charles idolized his brother, Henry was not as fond of his younger sibling. Reportedly, when Charles was 9 years old, Henry yanked the hat off a bishop and crammed it onto his brother's head. He then shouted that when he became king, he was going to make Charles the Archbishop of Canterbury, strictly so he could wear the long church robes, which would hide Charles's ugly, rickety legs. Apparently, this left Charles so distraught he had to be carried away in tears. True or not, the event highlights the dynamics at play within the royal family. Henry, as heir apparent, was being perfectly groomed for his role as leader, and Charles simply had to limp along behind him as a dutiful second son. So imagine the family's shock, and that of the nation, when Prince Henry caught typhoid fever and unexpectedly died at the age of 18, leaving little Charles as the new heir to the throne. The death of the Prince of Wales plunged his family and the country into deep mourning, and thrust the unprepared Charles straight into the spotlight. He would come to the throne on the 27th of March, 1625, and he was crowned in Westminster Abbey nearly a year later, on the 2nd of February, 1626. His French-born wife, Henrietta Maria, would not be crowned alongside her husband, however, as she was a practicing Catholic, and the ceremony itself used Anglican rites. Breaking with tradition, Charles wore white for the ceremony, which was considered unlucky. Further, an earthquake was felt during the coronation, which many pointed to as a bad omen. However, it would be hard to imagine that anybody could have predicted just how spectacularly troublesome and violent Charles's reign would be. Of course, very few people are complete disasters, myself excluded, obviously, and Charles did have his positive attributes. He was a devoted husband and doting father who enjoyed spending time with his wife and children, a trait not often to be found within the British royal family. He was also described as gentle and polite, with a great interest in fashion. He wore fine clothes and even sported an asymmetrical haircut, which was considered quite trendy at the time. You can see the hairstyle clearly in this triptych by Van Dyck. Notably, he was also a great patron of the arts, who transformed the royal collection into one of the most important in Europe, as it still remains to this day, thanks to his purchase of around 1,400 paintings and 400 pieces of sculpture. He commissioned architect Inigo Jones, playwright Ben Jonson, and portrait artist Van Dyck to create art and works for the enjoyment of his family and court. In 1635, he also commissioned Rubens to paint a grand scene on the ceiling of the banqueting house, part of the former palace of Whitehall. The artwork survives to this day and showcases the biblical glorification of Charles's father, King James. But all of these things alone do not a great king make. Charles was notorious for having no sense of humor and little self-confidence. He would prove to be a poor strategist who felt any means were justifiable to achieve his ends, and, to his last breath, would maintain that no one in England had the right to question what he did, or his motives for doing it. Historian Plantagenet Somerset Fry described Charles thusly, quote, "a strange mixture of great personal charm, modesty, and politeness, mixed with a lack of humor, a lot of nervous tension, and no self-confidence." And two contemporary accounts paint a similar picture. The Scottish ambassador described him as, quote, "overwhelmed in misfortunes by his own faults and from his own mistaken principles." And, damningly, the wife of one of the signatories of his execution warrant stated, quote, "men wondered that so good a man should be so bad a king." Charles's issues with the public began shortly after he took the throne, when he married the French Catholic sister of King Louis XIII, Henrietta Maria. A contemporary described her as, quote, "a papist, a French lady of haughty spirit," and another referred to her as, quote, "the popish brat of France," which I honestly think is kinda cool. The point is, the public at large was mistrustful of Catholics, and both the common people and those in government were opposed to the marriage for this reason. Charles promised he had no intention of relaxing religious restrictions on Catholicism in England, but it would later turn out that he had promised the exact opposite to Henrietta Maria's brother. This would be the first in a repeated series of events where the king would make promises to Scottish Presbyterians, English Anglicans, Irish Roman Catholics, and Puritan leaders that he never had any intention of keeping. Initially, Charles's personal life with Henrietta Maria was somewhat tense and cold, partially because he spent most of his free time with his father's old favorite and old lover, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham had a powerful influence on Charles, and the two embarked on a number of ill-advised misadventures together. Many saw Buckingham as the driving force behind the new king's decision, shortly after coming to the throne, to plunge England into an expensive and unsuccessful war with Spain. This was soon to be followed by a war with France, with a similar dire outcome. Members of Parliament, or MPs, who criticized Buckingham could find themselves arrested and imprisoned. Quite quickly, Parliament began to deny Charles's requests for money, knowing that it would go to Buckingham to use however he saw fit. Eventually, both the public and the politicians' dislike of the Duke came to a head on the 23rd of August, 1628, when he was assassinated, stabbed to death at a pub in Portsmouth. But Charles's problems with Parliament were far from over. The king seemed to clash with Parliament over nearly everything, including fundamental issues of governance authority and religious practices. Keep in mind that Parliament had existed in one form or another since the 13th century, and were, formally, the body by which the king was able to raise taxes, pass laws, billet troops, or even declare war. And although Parliament was originally filled with land-owning men of the King's Council, by the 17th century, members of Parliament were increasingly drawn from the professional classes, and these members did not look favorably on Charles's aristocratic beliefs and behaviors. Initially, Parliament attempted to curtail what they saw as Charles's careless actions, requesting that he sign a petition to acknowledge he could only levy taxes, impose martial law, imprison citizens without due process, or quarter troops without Parliament's consent. He assented to the petition on the 7th of June, 1628, but broke the contract by the end of the month, around which time he also dissolved Parliament, a tactic he deployed regularly, effectively firing everyone until further notice. Once, when the Speaker of the House of Commons attempted to adjourn discussions that criticized the king, he was held down in his chair by MPs long enough for the chamber to acclaim a resolution relating to Charles's attempts to levy tax. Things were coming to a boiling point for Parliament, but for Charles, he was well within his rights. In order to understand Charles's mindset, it's important to mention that he, as many monarchs before him, was a firm believer in the divine right of kings. This belief was that God chose kings to rule over the people of their country, and gave said king or queen sovereign immunity. As far as Charles was concerned, his God-ordained right was to be a good king and make life better for his citizens, however he saw fit. When Parliament would deny Charles's requests, or attempted to pass legislation he did not agree with, he viewed them as attempting to hamper his own God-given rights. The divine right, of course, relied heavily on religion, and this was another area in which Charles butted heads with, well, nearly everyone. He tried to introduce new and unpopular prayer books into Scotland and England, causing problems with Scottish Covenanters and English Puritans. He favored church doctrine from before the Reformation, enjoyed ritualistic services, and insisted on an episcopal form of church government, wherein church worship was celebrated with high ceremony, and bishops, appointed by the king himself, or his chosen Archbishop of Canterbury, all wore elaborate vestments. Many felt this setup was too close to the Roman Catholic Church for comfort. Puritans also disliked that these policies put the king ahead of the church, arguing that the king should be a servant of the public, answerable to the leaders of the church, who were, in turn, appointed by their own congregations. These issues in governance and religion would eventually lead to a catastrophic breakdown. In 1629, Charles again dissolved Parliament, but this time he would not call another for 11 years. This period of time would be referred to as personal rule, or, and I love the drama of this, the 11 years' tyranny. During this time, Charles claimed himself entitled to rule without Parliament, under divine right and royal prerogative. But ruling without Parliament proved harder than Charles had anticipated. For example, to raise money without parliamentary assistance was extremely difficult and required some out-of-the-box thinking, the first example of which I would actually find quite impressive if it weren't so ridiculous. Firstly, Charles resurrected an ancient law called the Distraint of Knighthood, which had not been used in over a century. This law required any man who earned £40 or more from land each year to present themselves at the king's coronation to be knighted. Using this edict, Charles fined any knight who had failed to attend his coronation 3 years previously, even those who had never been invited, and knights who refused to pay were imprisoned without trial. In Scotland, he attacked the nobility, officially revoking all gifts of royal or church land made to the nobility since 1540, and requiring an annual rent should they then wish to keep the land that was once gifted to them. The king then extended the boundaries of royal forests to exploit the land and fine its users. He would also sell off land to his wealthy friends, or enclose it to take the land out of common use, thus denying access to non-owners who previously utilized it. In some cases, these people had been living there, foresting timber and grazing their animals for years. All of this would be taken away from them by Charles's new decrees, which saw riots break out across the country. But it didn't stop there. The king then expanded the parameters of what was known as ship money. Previously, ship money was a tax authorized on coastal regions to be paid during wartime. Charles decided he would levy the tax during peacetime as well, despite public opposition. He also derived money from the granting of patents and monopolies, further angering the public, who would then be expected to pay higher prices. And lastly, Charles seized all money held in trust at the Mint of the Exchequer in the Tower of London. On the plus side, he did make peace with Spain and France, but only because the waging of wars was nearly impossible without the funding that Parliament alone could provide. But the king's personal rule came to an end with his attempts to reform the Episcopal Church of Scotland to bring it in line with the Church of England. This led to such widespread opposition that English and Scottish troops faced off at the border. Charles wanted to retain his authority in Scotland by force, but needed to recall Parliament to raise and pay for more troops. Parliament reconvened and denied his request. They were sent packing once more, but shortly thereafter the Scots invaded, defeating the English army and taking over parts of northern England. Charles turned back to Parliament for help, and they were able to reach a settlement with the Scots. Once that was settled, however, Parliament turned their attention to the king, determined to regain control and prevent their future dissolution by whatever means necessary. At this point, there were 493 members of the House of Commons, and more than 350 of them were in opposition of the king, a vast majority that made realizing their desires relatively easy. Subsequently, Parliament went after the king's trusted deputy, Earl Strafford, his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, and his Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, John Finch. The latter two were formally impeached, but Strafford was accused of high treason and sentenced to death. However, royal assent was needed to carry out the act. These men were wildly unpopular, and Charles, battered by his failures with the Scots and the invasion of England, with few supporters left in the Commons, and fearing civil and political unrest, as well as the potential danger to his family that came along with it, reluctantly signed the death warrant of his dear friend.
Knowing the king would now acquiesce if required, Parliament passed an unprecedented act, begrudgingly signed by the king, that stated the English Parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent, thus ensuring that Charles could never dismiss them again.
However, not known for keeping his word, the king fully intended to regain control of Parliament and the country by force. Charles was fully convinced that a number of Puritans, egged on by members of the House of Commons who were vocal critics of the king, had assisted in the Scottish invasion of England and had been undermining their sovereign, turning the public against him. I hasten to add that Charles was doing a good enough job of that himself, regardless. There were also rumors that Parliament had intentions to depose the Queen. On hearing this, Henrietta Maria reportedly told her husband, quote, "Go and pull those rogues out by the ears, or never see my face again." And Charles gave it his best shot. On the 3rd of January, 1642, he traveled to the Palace of Westminster with 400 men, and, along with 80 of them, stormed the building armed with swords and pistols. Boldly, the king entered the House of Commons, where no monarch was permitted, and strode through the chamber. He approached the Speaker of the House, William Lenthal, and stated, quote, "Mr. Speaker, I must for a time make bold with your chair." Lenthal stood, and Charles took his place. The king began calling for the 5 members of Parliament that he suspected had aided in the Scottish invasion, but he was met with total silence, the rest of the chamber stunned and angered into silence by the king's sudden appearance. Charles then turned to Lenthal, asking him where the men he was after had gone. Kneeling, the speaker famously replied, quote, "May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as this house is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here, and I humbly beg your majesty's pardon that I cannot give any other answer than this to what your majesty is pleased to demand of me." This was the first time that a speaker had declared his allegiance to the liberty of Parliament rather than the will of a monarch. The king responded, quote, "'Tis no matter. I think my eyes are as good as another's." He studied the benches for a, quote, "pretty while, then lamented, 'All my birds have flown.' He left the chair and walked out, quote, "in a more discontented and angry passion than he came in." Here, I will mention that the 5 MPs Charles was looking for had long since fled the building, out the window, in fact, and into a boat that had sailed them away to safety. According to contemporary MP Edward Hyde, the unprecedented entrance of the king into the Commons, where no sovereign was permitted, was, quote, the highest breach of privilege that could be imagined, and, in doing so, Charles plunged the country into chaos. Parliament quickly seized the capital, and around 6,000 citizens erected barricades and drug out cannon as London armed itself, firmly declaring their opposition to the king. It became clear to all that the country was on the brink of war. Charles soon fled the city for Hampton Court Palace, and 2 days later to Windsor Castle, fearing both for his own life and that of his family. He would not return to London for 7 years, when he would be brought back at the end of the Civil War as a criminal, tried as a tyrant, and executed as a traitor. For reference, when I refer to the English Civil War, I am talking about a series of civil wars, skirmishes, and political shifts in governmental and parliamentarian power between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. This was known as the Great Rebellion until the 19th century. Fighting took place in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland for nearly a decade. When fighting began, in August of 1642, it was largely believed that the conflict would be settled quickly, perhaps even with a single battle. This could not have been further from the truth. The English Civil War would turn out to be the bloodiest battle ever fought on home soil, with an estimated 15 to 29% of adult males in England and Wales serving in combat. Nearly 5% of the population died from war-related causes, with around 250,000 deaths recorded. In an excellent display of nomenclature, the two sides of the warring factions became known as the Cavaliers, led by King Charles, and the Roundheads, led by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. The Cavaliers were royalists, supporters of King Charles I, and later his son and my spiritual husband, King Charles II. Initially, the term Cavalier was an insult coined by parliamentarians, referring to the Royalists' political and social attitudes, as well as their frivolous behavior and their lack of, quote, respect to the laws of the land. The painting, The Laughing Cavalier, is a prime example of these, quote, capricious men who cared more for vanity than the nation at large. These days, the term Cavalier refers to a lackadaisical attitude, but also to the clothing worn by the Royalists in the Civil War period. And, let's be honest, if it's a fashion competition, the Royalists definitely win.
You better work.
And they soon turned their pejorative nickname into a badge of honor. The Roundheads were supporters of the Parliament of England. This, too, was initially an insulting term, referring to the closely cropped hair of the Puritans, in opposition to the flowing locks of the Royalists. The parliamentarians were initially not so keen on this nickname, and at one point it was actually a punishable offense to call a fellow soldier a Roundhead. Take note that both Royalists and Roundheads originally believed that the country was best served by a well-ordered monarchy. The primary issue was that there was little agreement on what well-ordered actually meant. Royalists believed that Parliament and the Church of England were subordinate to the king, while the parliamentarians believed his supremacy should not extend to religion and, in many ways, politics. Although the Royalists were victorious in some battles, and, at times, were even in control of the majority of the country, the First Civil War ended with a parliamentarian victory. The new model army, formed by the parliamentarians, were a powerful force for myriad reasons. Parliament had far superior resources to money and manpower, including nearly the entire navy, giving them access to a system of logistics and supply. Adding to that, King Charles was indecisive and ill-advised, with many of his council having no previous military experience. The Roundheads also utilized propaganda, sending their message to the common folk. Their control of London made the dissemination of printed information on a large scale easy, in a way the Royalists could never match. In 1646, following a series of Royalist defeats, the king was using Oxford as a base, but he was under siege by the Parliamentarian army. He managed to escape the city dressed as a servant and handed himself over to the Scottish Presbyterian army in Newark, thinking they might shelter and support him. Instead, they handed him over to the parliamentarians in exchange for £100,000 and the promise of more. The king was first taken to Holdenby House, followed by Newmarket, Oatlands, and Hampton Court Palace. He successfully escaped from his former royal residence, but would again miscalculate his support by heading to the Isle of Wight, assuming the colonel there, Robert Hammond, would be sympathetic to his cause. He was wildly incorrect and found himself a prisoner again. However, Charles, having successfully escaped captivity twice now, believed he could do so again. Coded letters from the king were smuggled in and out of the castle via a servant who looked after his linen, and on the 20th of March, 1648, he attempted to break out of his lodgings. Horses and loyal supporters were standing by, ready to return Charles to the mainland, and from there to Suffolk, where a ship would be waiting to take him to safety in France. All the king needed to do was climb out of his bedchamber window. Easier said than done, of course. Charles confidently told his page that he knew his head would fit between the window bars, and, quote, where that would pass, the body would follow. However, writing about the event later, his page recorded, quote, His Majesty, too late, found himself mistaken. Instead of slipping out to freedom, Charles became wedged between an iron bar and the window frame. Those below, awaiting his arrival, had no choice but to turn back. Not one to give up, however, the king gave it another go on the 29th of May. Nitric acid and a hacksaw had been smuggled into the castle, and Charles attempted to use these to remove the bars at his window. 2 guards were bribed for their silence as the king attempted his escape, but they betrayed him at the last minute. Accounts say either Charles noticed the sentries below his window and realized the plan was foiled, or that Colonel Hammond himself walked into the room and pithily offered, quote, to take leave of your Majesty, for I hear you are going away, to which Charles is reported to have given a defeated laugh. The latter story seems less likely, but is definitely more entertaining. Regardless of how it played out, Charles was kept in captivity at Carisbrooke for just over a year, and, throughout, continued in negotiations with Parliament. Most parliamentarians assumed that the king's defeat in battle would force him to comply with their terms, but his refusal to compromise surprised and frustrated both his opponents as well as his allies. Both Oliver Cromwell and Thomas Fairfax believed they could eventually come to terms with the king, convincing him to agree to a written constitution which maintained the monarchy but limited its authority. However, Charles refused to repent, seek peace, or admit defeat. Instead of trying to come to terms with the parliamentarian forces, he managed to successfully exploit the divisions between his opponents. he negotiated a secret alliance with the English Presbyterians and the Scots, which led to a Scottish invasion and renewed fighting. The Royalists were quickly subdued, and this wave of battle essentially ended any chance their side had of winning the war. But it's important to mention still, at this point, many in Parliament still thought a truce or compromise could be made. In fact, a vote in Parliament on whether to continue to negotiate with Charles was taken and passed at 129 to 83. However, soon the Army General Council intercepted coded messages from Charles stating that any concessions he made were given strictly to facilitate his escape, and he had no intention whatsoever of upholding them. This turned some of Charles's supporters against him and provided ample fodder for his enemies, who believed he had now shown himself as untrustworthy. Soon thereafter, the idea that only the king's immediate removal could successfully end the conflict began to take shape. Aware that the king still had supporters, but that the idea of removing him completely was still unpalatable to those even on his opposing side, the new model army decided to act. On the 6th of December, 1648, soldiers commanded by Colonel Thomas Pride arrived at Parliament, dismissed the guards, and stood at the stairs leading to the Commons' chamber. They had with them a list of all MPs considered to be enemies of the parliamentarian forces, including those 129 MPs who had previously voted to continue negotiations with the king. Anybody on this list was refused entry into the House. 186 MPs were excluded from taking their seats in the Commons, 45 were arrested, and a further 86 left in protest of what they, correctly, viewed as a military coup. Those remaining, estimated to be around 200, down from 470, became known as the Rump Parliament. This successfully eliminated anyone from Parliament who still backed negotiations with the king, although I think it's safe to say there's still a large leap from refusing negotiations with somebody to cutting off their head. But the civil wars were not yet at an end. Trouble was brewing in Ireland. Oliver Cromwell hoped the king would order his men to end negotiations with the Irish Confederacy to prevent the outbreak of a new war. Once it became clear that the king had no intention of attempting to end the conflict, Cromwell, and many others, became convinced that the only way to secure peace was for Charles to die. Reportedly, Cromwell stated, quote, "We will cut off his head with the crown still on it." To this end, a bill was brought to Parliament with a proposal to bring the king to trial. Parliament is comprised of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. For bills to pass, the two bodies must each give approval, and the monarch their consent. However, the Commons declared themselves the supreme power in the state, capable of legislating alone, and took no note of the Lords' objection to the trial. In the end, the vote was taken by just 46 MPs, 26 ayes to 20 noes. On the 1st of January, 1649, the Commons passed an ordinance to put Charles Stuart on trial for treason. And with that, we finish part 1 of the story. Stay tuned for the conclusion in my next video, where I will cover the dramatic trial, gruesome execution, and the curious events that unfolded when the king's tomb was reopened 150 years later.
This has been Crown and Kingdom. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help me keep my channel growing.